Okay, so good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Antonio Guarino. I am a professor of economics at University College London, UCL, and the president of the Association of Italian Scientists in the UK, AISUK. I am here with some distinguished guests to talk about COVID-19. In previous discussions, we have talked about the health issues of COVID-19. Today, the focus is different, is about the economy. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a big economic crisis. We are in the middle of a big economic crisis, probably the biggest since the Second World War. In the Second World War. And how do we get out of this? How do we face this economic crisis? How do we do it at the European level? To discuss this, I invited Luis Garicano. Hello, Luis. Luis is a professor of the IE Business School, and before that he was a professor for many years at the London School of Economics, just next door. But now he's on leave because he's a member of the European Parliament, and in that position he has contributed to the design of this response to the crisis. Then we have Giancarlo Corsetti. Hello, Giancarlo. Giancarlo is a professor in Cambridge. He's a macroeconomist. Before joining Cambridge, he was a professor in Yale and in Rome, in Italy. And then we have Ferdinando Giuliano. Ciao, Ferdinando. Ferdinando is at Bloomberg. He's an opinion writer at Bloomberg. Before that, he was at the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. And before that, actually, he was at the Financial Times, where we met here in London. So I will be the chair of this discussion, and then I let Ferdinando moderate the discussion. So I will start with Luis. Luis, we all know about this recovery fund. It keeps changing name, but let's call it recovery fund. Can you just give us a broad picture, how big it is, where the money would come from, to whom it would go, according to which criteria, why it would work, and where are we now in terms of political debate, because it's a project, it's not completely approved. If you can give us the broad perspective, Ferdinando will then decide in which direction to go. Please.
That sounds like a good plan. Thanks for having me here. It's my pleasure to try to continue to illuminate this conversation. To start with the basics, the European Union has had a pretty aggressive, unusually aggressive and organized response to this crisis compared to the past. It has had put in place 3 lines of defense. First, the European Central Bank very early on, with a very large pandemic emergency purchase program, a program that allows the Union to basically ensure that the countries will be able to access the capital markets without a big sovereign crisis. First 750 billion, now expanded by another 600 billion. Then there was a second line of defense, which was liquidity provided by the member states. 3 programs, including a modification of the old rescue program, the ESM, that was they are so controversial in Italy. But in fact, Italy and Spain managed to remove the conditionality, and now it's a program that actually could be used without conditions. It's 240 billion. There's another 100 billion for unemployment support, and there is a 25 billion program of guarantees by the European Investment Bank. So those things are basically done. And now Europe proposes a third step. The Commission proposes a third step. The Parliament proposes a third step. And as we will discuss later, the Council has to really decide on whether this is going to happen or not, which is this recovery plan you're referring to. This 750 billion, basically 433 billion in transfers, 67 billion in loan guarantees, and 250 billion in loans. So 250 billion has to be paid back, 500 billion doesn't have to be paid back. And this is the huge new feature of this program that it is not in the form of loans and liquidity support, but it's in the form of investments by Europe. And this consists of this 750 billion can be used to support reform programs presented by the member states, 310 billion in reforms and 250 billion in loans. Sorry, 310 billion in direct investments and 250 in loans. Then it can be used to support the private sector, to support the green and digital transition, and to support cohesion. So the biggest part of the program is indeed getting these reform programs that the member states will propose. The idea is member states will propose a reform program, Europe will see it and decide and fund it. This is indeed large. It's new because it's for the first time that Europe actually contributes to borrows together and in a large amount. There were smaller programs, and contributes to stabilizing European economies. And it probably will be funded, and this is a huge also step forward, but by own resources by Europe, by taxes that will flow directly to the European Treasury, or at least we are hoping. Politically, to finish up this first overview, basically there is support by Parliament. We basically 505 MEPs have basically supported this before it came up in a resolution that we sponsored from my group, from Renew Europe. It has support from the Commission, and it has support from basically the overwhelming majority of member states. There are 4 member states that have objections. One that is the crucial one, which is Holland, is the one that is basically raising the bigger objections. The Prime Minister there and the government, and actually with opposition supported by Parliament, object to 3 features that are crucial in this program. The dominance of investments versus loans. They want more loans and less investments. The lack of macro conditionality. They want that member states have to make efforts to get back on track and to kind of austerity, to define it in a very broad sense, to make budget cuts. And they also object to the size. They think that the program is too large. So the balance of loans and grants, the conditionality, and the size. This weekend, we will have this 19th of June, we will have the first meeting by the member states to decide on this program. It's too early. There is not negotiation box. There will be another meeting in July, in which hopefully the Council will agree and will find a way to respond to these objections. Notice that this is part of a gigantic negotiation, which is not just this Next Generation EU, this recovery and reconstruction package, but also the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union, which is the budget for the next 7 years. So the 2 pieces should fit together. The program that Europe is going to raise is going to go into programs that already Europe has. So the multi-annual financial framework will benefit from all this extra money, but has to be negotiated as well. And the negotiation is extremely complex.
Luis, let me stay with you for just a moment, and I'll ask you to keep your hat as a politician for a second, and then we can go back to your old self as an economist. Where do you see the landing point in these negotiations? I mean, obviously there is, as you said, a very, very large majority in favor of this package, but Europe, the EU still works with unanimity, so veto players do have quite a bit of power. So where do you see the Frugal Four, and in particular the Netherlands, giving grounds, and where do you see their objections as tougher to overcome?
So the Frugal Four is interesting that they are 2 of them are socialists, Denmark, and they have socialist prime ministers, and Sweden. There are 2 that have coalition governments. Austria has the Greens in the coalition. The Netherlands has D66, the Progressive Liberals, in the coalitions, which means that the government's position is not as sharp as it would have been in the previous crisis. They haven't reacted as aggressively as they have in the past. They've reacted more moderately and more open to compromise. The Parliament has been wanting its own resources, and there are 2 dossiers that are coming together, which is how much money and how do we pay for the money. It's possible that in the how much money, there are two branches. There's the how much money for the future 7 years budget and how much money for the recovery plan for the next couple of years. So there are three elements in a way which are interrelated: the own resources, the future budget, and the recovery plan. I would imagine that between those three elements there will be bargaining. For me and for the Parliament, the own resources dossier is extremely important. I can imagine countries will be willing to postpone this and say, well, we'll see how we pay for this when we get there, which is in 7 years' time. Of course, my fear with that, if that was the compromise, the landing zone, postpone the own resources discussion and see in 7 years, is that in 7 years, very likely, some veto player would say, well, we're not going to increase our contribution and we're not going to allow own resources, and then it would all come out of reductions in the EU budget, which wouldn't be a desirable outcome for us. But that might be a place where compromise would be found in the Council, not one that the Parliament would be satisfied with.
But you could see the current program, I mean, leaving aside how it's funded, but the size, the balance between loan and grants, and the lack of macro conditionality, you think all these three features could be kept, or something would happen?
My politician.
No, your political assessment.
I mean, as a politician in the European Parliament, I have to tell you that for the Parliament, it will not be acceptable to get below 500 billion in grants. So we will not accept that being cut. That's the minimum acceptable for us. And we also see the own resources as very important, and we see the MFF, which is the Charles Michel proposal, as the minimum. So we would very much defend the package as it is now. Okay.
Let me move to Giancarlo Corsetti. So I will ask you to comment on this from 2 points of view. One, as an economist, just how much as of a kind of step change, historic change this is from a kind of economist point of view. But at the same time, I'd like to ask you, a little bit of skepticism, a note of skepticism, if possible, which comes from what we were discussing before. Is the lack of conditionality really a good thing, given the track record of kind of government spending in some countries? Let's not name them for the sake of politeness. Is this something which is really good, something we should be excited about, or maybe in 10 years' time, economists will be looking at this program and say, there should have been more conditionality, really? So, Giancarlo.
Very good questions. So, on the, in a way, on the profile of the initiative, I think it's mostly politically large, in the sense that some lines have been crossed. This is a point that's been made many times. Clearly, it's not the kind of arrangement that many economists devoted to the integration of Europe would have been welcoming. Like there is really no part on the demand management, facing the tail risk, facing the conditions that could create again the involution of the economy, the financial system that we saw in 2011, 2010. So I think it's an important step forward. It's not, it's not the end of the story from the point of view of the lovers of the European integration, but it's definitely something to care a lot about. Now, on conditionality, there is a sad truth here, which is conditionality has always been a very imperfect scheme. The conditions are very much always ambiguous, sometimes inappropriate. When they're appropriate, may come at the wrong time. If you look at the history of the international institutions, conditionality has been changed. The idea, the content of conditionality has been changed. At this time is especially a problem because we really are facing something completely new with this crisis. We have very little idea about what will wait for us in a few months when the phase of emergency, the lockdown, will be somehow relaxed or maybe reimposed. And we actually don't even have a good idea about how long this emergency will last in terms of epidemiology. It could become an endemic problem. So all we know is that we are now facing an accumulation of very imbalanced position in the financial and non-financial corporate sector. We know that there is poverty increasing. We know that unemployment is increasing. At some point, we will have to deal with this. And the European Recovery Fund, again, is small, can play an important role. I really do not understand what kind of conditions could be imposed in a situation like this, in which, at one point, there will be important distributional and efficiency issues to face. Like, do we save the firms? Do we save the banks? How much support of income will give? So I'm very wary that we are sort of underestimating the challenge that repairing the damage of the virus is creating. So even with the best intention, I don't understand what conditions could be attached to this program. And by the way, the program is not large; it's small. It is pretty contained. So it is, it should be manageable from the EU perspective. On the other side, and I conclude with this, I think it's a window that it's opening, and it's not clear whether it will remain open or will expand. So I don't understand whether governments understand this point, which is it will be money coming and maybe not be there in the future. So it is extremely important to use it as best as we can, because it can only create bad feelings and destroy all the goodwill in the future if it's not used very well.
If I could just add something to what Giancarlo just said, Fernando.
I was gonna ask you to do that, and I mean, you are, in a way, challenge you a little bit, because in your previous life as an economist, you've looked a lot at the kind of quality of spending and the importance of institutions in delivering good spending. And if I may say, we have quite a diverse set of governments in especially Southern Europe, which is the big beneficiary of this this plan. We have a government in Greece which seems to be very kind of efficiency oriented, with very clear plans, and this was even before the pandemic, and my impression is that they will continue on this line. And you have, for example, a government in Italy which is a coalition government with very different views on how the money should be spent. For example, Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio was talking about funding income tax cuts with European money, which doesn't seem to be compatible with the way this fund was set up. So, my question to you is, how can we guarantee that this money goes where it should go? And let me be a little bit provocative. Maybe us as economists were very excited about this idea of finally transfers flowing around the union as a fiscal union should work. But maybe as observer of political issues, is the EU ready? Is the Eurozone ready for money going directly from, the kind of Dutch taxpayers, the German taxpayers, to the Italian, Spanish, and Greek government to be spent without them having to worry to pay it back?
I share your concerns, Ferdinando, and I share the concern that Giancarlo expressed. I mean, if this program is wasted income tax cuts, this is the end. I mean, we are done. I wanted to make a distinction between macro conditionality and reform-oriented conditionality. So I would think reform plans have to be binding, and I think that we have to insist that there is some conditionality on what the money is used for. I mean, obviously, money is fungible, so governments can just decide not to make any roads, use their own money to fund income tax cuts, and then pay the roads from here. So that's a problem. But I still would like to see serious reform plans on the governments. I think the conditionality that we are worried about, some of us after the previous crisis, was this kind of macro, kind of austerity-related conditionality that didn't necessarily have a lot of support in the literature, support in the evidence, and it was just kind of a little bit not necessarily well thought out. But I do think that reform plans have to be serious, they have to be approved, and I think there is a weakness there, just to put it on the table. Right now, the reform plans are not seen by Parliament, they just come from the country to the Commission. I don't think the European Commission has the legitimacy to change those reform plans. I don't think the European Commission, 4 guys in an office in Berlemont working on the Italian desk or the Spanish desk, can really choose whether this or that reform is necessary. And I think that if you want these reform plans to be legitimate and to work, I think you need to include more democratic accountability and more democratic institutions, meaning the European Parliament in that case.
Can I, Fernando?
Sure.
No, I was talking about macro conditionality. Again, like there are clear conditions, and we have been discussing this, so we understand that macro outlook will be essential, and but as long as it's not internalized by the government, it's a little bit pointless. What I was saying, that the approach of the fund, I repeat what Luis is saying, is actually smart in the sense that it links it to specific project. At the point it bypasses the problem of macro conditionality. I don't think people really understood that this is it, in the sense that if this program fails, we go back several steps, and it will take years to mend the problem. So there's a little bit of a reputation, like an intertemporal approach that we know for governments may not be relevant. But what I want to say is that the reform plan has one problem at this junction, which is it's very tempting now to envision great changes. But the problem we have in the next few months is basically to mend the damage. Now we will need to sort of keep things going. So it would be again, it is intellectually a big challenge. How do you do these things? No. The good thing about the reform is that sharing the EU objective, there is the digitalization aspect. I think, for example, that given the nature of the pandemic, digitalization reform may be actually fantastic. No? Think about the Italian state. More digitalization in the public administration could maybe help bypassing some of the, century-long problems in slowness and accountability. Some of the emergency challenge from the pandemic could be turned into an opportunity to do what, in any case, we should do now, which is to invest in remote, like in basically all kind of solution to administration that may not, may cut down on time and waste in implementing administrative acts or whatever is there. So I wonder whether it could be explained a little bit better, this point, which is it is a window that may become wider or smaller. It is designed in such a way that people could really take advantage of it in a situation where I'm sorry, I'm a little bit pessimistic, but what expects us in the next few months is something that we never experienced. And it will be, and remember, it will be politically very unsettling, because distribution will become, the big elephant in the room. How do you manage the cost of this crisis? How do you keep things going? So it would be important to clarify a little bit that there is an inherent conditionality in it that cannot be spelled out maybe, but it's very heavy.
So Luis, I think, to make it even more simple, because this is a video for everyone, not just for economists. Let's give a concrete example, what Giancarlo was saying, Ferdinando was alluding to. If the Italian government wants to spend the money for Alitalia, okay, and not for the university system, how are you going to avoid that? How are you going to avoid that this is actually wasted money in inefficient projects and not used for what the country needs, which is investments in whatever helps productivity? How do you avoid this?
The way that the Commission has set it up right now is that there is something called the European semester, which is a process of evaluation of the macro policies of the European Union. Within that semester, there are national reform plans, things that the countries are going to reform. And these recovery and reconstruction plans have to fit, recovery and resilience plans. You're right, they changed names, Antonio. Recovery and resilience plans have to fit within the reform plans. So you don't get the money as a check. I wrote an article last Friday, a big article in the Spanish newspaper called Europe is not an ATM, an automatic cash dispenser machine, okay? Europe is not just like, okay, you go there, you take the money and you just spend it on drinks and rock and roll, okay? You have to present a plan. This plan has to be consistent with these reform programs in this European semester. And they give you the money with milestones for this plan. That's how it's set up. Now, how politically feasible is it going to be to say, oh, well, sorry, you didn't spend the money the right way, so this milestone wasn't met, I won't give you more money, is to be seen, okay? But the idea is clear that you're going to have a commitment to, you say, well, look, we're going to do this reform, we're going to provide money for research, we're going to have an evaluation agency for research universities, and the better universities are going to be funded in this particular new way, and that we're going to fund through this reform plan. And then the Commission will say, yep, sure, here's the money. The idea is that that should be the purpose, but then you just pick up the money and you say, I'll give it to Alitalia and sorry for the universities. What are the consequences? How can we stop that? That's totally not spelled out. In theory, there will be a process that will say you haven't fulfilled the milestone and we will just go to the start. But as Giancarlo and Ferdinando are hinting, I mean, politically, this is difficult with sovereign governments.
Luis, I want to move a little bit of discussion to another part, which I think is just as historic, and you alluded to, is the aspect on own resources for the European Union. Now, again, another provocation. You know, in theory, economists are very excited about fiscal unions and, you know, a common treasury having its own resources to then distribute across the Eurozone. Now, I have one concern, however, is that, you know, one problem with the EU, at least, you know, the way we, I mean, actually, there are two things I want to ask you about. One is, you know, we're now looking at the EU creating a common treasury of sort. But we'd always thought of the Eurozone having to create its own treasury. So, you know, how do we see this? I mean, I'm a little bit curious about the fact that, you know, Sweden, Denmark, you know, countries which are outside of the Eurozone are taking part in this. So, I mean, is this a move from them into the Eurozone of sort, or are we forgetting about the Eurozone by moving all of this at the EU level? So that's one part of the question. Second part of the question is, you know, when we look at Europe, there is always, you know, this possibly caricature, but, you know, as a high tax, high spending part of the world. And, you know, what you're suggesting here with the own resources agenda are more taxes, which at this juncture would not replace all taxes, but would just add to the old kind of state level taxes. how do we avoid that the European Union becomes, a place with yet more taxes? I mean, there may be good taxes, which lots of economists like carbon taxes, ways to avoid tax avoidance by multinational corporations. But, if I look, for example, at this idea of a single market tax, I mean, what is it? Why should companies be taxed for selling their goods abroad in a free way? If I, maybe, push it to the extreme a little bit. So my two questions are: great to have own resources, but why EU own resources, and why more taxes without getting rid of all taxes?
Okay, so first, to start with your point about the European Treasury and the Eurozone and the budget for the Eurozone. Basically, this is replacing the Eurozone budget. That's correct. There was a germ of a Eurozone budget, a tiny germ, 17 billion for something called the BICC, the Budgetary Instrument for Convergence and Competitiveness. That has been replaced by all this. So this has basically killed that effort at an online, at a treasury for the European Union, Eurozone. I don't expect Denmark and Sweden to just ignore this and say, "Oh well, this is fine. We will get it for all together." Obviously, it solves the problem of the Eastern European countries by having an instrument that covers everybody. Romania and Czechia and other countries which are not out of the euro are happy, but it causes a problem with Sweden and Denmark. And I wouldn't be surprised if the 19th, what Sweden and Denmark are going to say is, "Look, we don't want any instrument, and we don't have any problem. We have our own fiscal policy. This is the only ones who don't have the fiscal policy of the euro area countries. So why don't you do this for the euro area?" That, I think I would expect them to say this on the 19th summit. That would be a very possible objection. Does this all mean that they have accepted the euro as no? I don't think that means that. Denmark has explicit opt-out. Does it mean on the other side that we've been up on the euro area? On your second question on our resources, I would say, Ferdinando, it's not more taxes. There are some things for which Europe has a competitive advantage in obtaining some type of resources, particular resources that have to do with things that fall in between the cracks of the countries, particularly corporate tax base. You know that Holland, Luxembourg, Ireland are kind of playing these games where basically countries move their money in between, and a lot of revenue is lost. So I think there are some issues for which Europe has a competitive advantage, and I would hope that it could use these taxes, raise these taxes, and then use it to replace member states' contributions. Until the rebate debate that Thatcher ran, there was no financing of the European Union by direct state contributions. Europe was financed by the taxes that Europe would raise, VAT and customs duties mainly. And that's the way it should go. It shouldn't be funded by the member states bargaining every year, how much money am I going to put, because that's a disaster. That limits their autonomy, creates a lot of acrimony, etc. So own resources are the way to go. I don't think they should involve higher taxes, indeed.
Giancarlo, I want to go back to you on an issue which we've touched upon, but I think is interesting of some further discussion, and it's where the ESM falls into all of this. Now, personally, I've always seen the ESM, especially the programs after Greece, as a big success. And possibly one of the most important institutions which have been created in Europe over, the last decade or so, even more. Now, it has a very bad reputation at the moment in some countries. Italy is a prime example. But also, I was talking to people in Greece, and they're looking even at this new ESM, and they say, well, we don't really, even with fewer conditions, we don't really like it that much. And I wonder whether, this is a problem for Europe from the point of view of, that having a stabilization instrument which helps you in the case of self-fulfilling crisis? Or do you think the new ECB, as it were, which is a lot more interventionist, with its quantitative easing program, both before the pandemic and now during the pandemic. Do you think that now we have a very different central bank, we actually don't really need the ESM as an instrument to help us in crisis? And I'm asking you because I know you've written a lot about self-fulfilling crisis and how we avoid a repeat of the Eurozone crisis.
No, the ESM is definitely an important institution in Europe, and it creates flexible instruments. It should be there, no doubt about it. Now, it is, in general, the problem. There are two issues with instruments like the ESM. The big one is the fact that no matter how important the intervention of the ESM is, countries will need to rely on market financing. So this is what creates, I guess, the most important reason not to be very wary about going to the ESM, because for stigma reason, for the composition and institutional structure of the ESM, for the weight of the creditors in the institution so far, seniority of ESM loans may, like the ESM can give with one hand and take out with the other hand, in the sense it may complicate market access instead of facilitating market access. But on the other hand, there is an issue which is pure liquidity support. It's very rare. There is always some value at risk when you intervene. So all the crises are a combination of fundamental weaknesses and self-fulfilling aspects. It's good to take out the self-fulfilling, but there will be some value at risk there. So far, the ECB has been intervening. So this a little bit, the OMTs as a program, the outright monetary transactions in 2012, were designed as a strong signal. In a way, they were effective without actual purchases of debt, which is by the book what a lender of last resort can do at its best. But it's unclear to me that without the intervention of the ECB later in the market, the markets would have been stabilized. So there is a little bit of the issue of the value at risk of the fiscal, the fiscal transfer of the transfer of risk across the balance sheet. Now, if you look at the US, the Fed has gone much farther, but there is some kind of explicit fiscal backing, fiscal guarantee on this value. This is the problem in Europe, which is an institutional problem, whether the ECB can go farther and accumulate value at risk in its balance sheet without an obvious fiscal relation, an obvious fiscal backing or ability of the fiscal side. This issue of the value of the value at risk, that the potential accumulation of losses, is now compounded by the current crisis, because obviously the expansion of the program is much larger. So the ESM is a valuable instrument. It should be there. At this stage, it's all connected. The reform of the institutional framework of the EU is all connected. How much will the ECB be willing to work? How large will be these new programs, and how they will relate to the ESM? Having said so, again, the major problem with the ESM is the fact that people are wary that market access may actually be hampered rather than favored by involvement of the ESM, and that I think is the criteria.
Thank you. So we talked for almost 1 hour. It was a wonderful discussion. I know that Luis has now another meeting to go to. I would like to thank all of you. Thank Ferdinando for moderating so well this discussion. Luis, don't go just now, because just before you go, at least I always hope that some people in the audience are students, so I want to show them a book that all Italians should know, but probably they don't. Do you know this book, Luis? Il Manifesto di Ventotene. I will send it to you as a gift to thank you for the participation. Okay. I invite all students to read this book, which is a milestone in the literature for the European Union. And I will send another copy also to Mr. Johnson here at number 10. By the way, I think that one of the great things of Brexit is that probably without Brexit, all this operation of the European Union wouldn't be happening. So maybe we should thank him. Anyway, thank you, Giancarlo. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Ferdinando. We talk in another occasion. Bye.